Hello, Nick Tyrone, neoliberal centrist dad, here with you again. The topic today is around borders, specifically looking at the Irish border and then bouncing that out into a larger topic, essentially. So, thank you to returning guests if you've seen me. Sorry, I look a little tired, don't I? I am a bit knackered. Getting back from Ireland and then getting back into work and all that jazz, it's been a little draining. So sorry if I look a little dopey. Uh, I will battle through. So the first thing to say about all this is when we went to Ireland. So I'll give you the route. We drove from London to Liverpool, and then we took the ferry from Liverpool to Belfast. We went around Northern Ireland, around the coast, around the northern coast, and then we went down the west coast of Ireland into the Republic, and then basically around the south coast. We basically did a circle. That's the easiest way to look at it. And the interesting thing about it to me in regards to this topic is we were never asked to show our passports once. As in, I could have not brought them, and it wouldn't have made a difference to our trip. Which was surprising to me. So I wasn't asked for passports going from Liverpool to Belfast. In some ways, fair enough. If you look at it just in isolation, you go, well, you were traveling from one UK city to another. You're not leaving the country, right? Except we all know that that's a bit strange given the situation with Northern Ireland and Ireland being in the EU. And I wasn't asked for passports on the way back either. This sort of strikes me that if you're European, right, so you're Spanish or French or German, right, and you want to come to the UK and you want to stay in the UK kind of as long as you want. Let's say you don't have to work. Let's say you've got some money and you just want to come and you don't want any hassles and you just want to stay in the UK for as long as you want. You don't want to abide by the 90-day rule and all that jazz. You could fly into Dublin and then drive up to Belfast and then take the ferry. And if you're like me, what happened to me, that's it. No one's going to check your passport. I mean, here's the thing. I don't particularly care about this. I wasn't incensed by it. It's interesting in the debate around borders and around the debate around immigration that we're having. So the first thing to say about the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, for those of you who have travelled across it, particularly if you've travelled across it many times, is, as you'll know, it's barely a border. I know in the past that has not been the case, but it's a huge border. It's just shy of 500 kilometers end to end. It's very all over the place. It kind of weaves and it goes crazy. I should know, but I don't actually know why it's such a nutty shape. It's probably something to do with some ancient clan borders or something, isn't it? Because that's usually what these things boil down to. But really unpoliceable. And actually, that was, although that was never discussed during the 2016 EU referendum, that became really clear after Leave won that, oh shit, we're going to have to think about this. What do we do? And in the end, there was a sort of fudge that was really very predictable, which was Northern Ireland would essentially stay in the single market for goods so that you didn't have to worry about that border too much. And in essence, they created a customs border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And that's the way they got around it. But it's a strange one as well for me, because when I think back to the Brexit debate, when I think back to not really before the referendum or during the referendum campaign, but after Leave had won, and there was a debate around what Brexit should look like from many different quarters. The big one being that kind of won in the end, which is it should be as harsh as possible. Not that we got no deal, and there were people pushing for no deal between the UK and EU, but we'd have a very stripped down deal, and we'd be out of the single market, and we'd be out of the customs union, and freedom of movement would go away. All that. And that's what happened. But between 2016 and the 2019 general election, so really the latter half of that entire decade, really, we discussed what do we want in terms of immigration? What does Britain want now that we're going to leave the EU in terms of what does immigration look like? What do borders look like? And one of the big things that I recall from the time that seems kind of quaint now, given where the right in Britain has gone, is it was sort of weirdly pro-immigration. So the idea was, well, we don't want a kind of border where anyone from Europe, an EU state, can just rock up and they can live here and work here as long as they want, and they have all the rights of a British citizen. We don't want that. But actually, we're not anti-immigration. And in fact, one of the things that was a big argument during the campaign and then afterwards was, well, there's something a bit racist about the idea that we should just let everyone from the European continent come to Britain and do what they like, basically. I mean, it's not really the case, but just go with the argument. And so why aren't we doing that with other places? Why can't we have more immigration from different parts of the world? And what was interesting about that argument, I remember there was a Tory MP, I won't embarrass him by mentioning him. I'm really tempted, but I'm not going to. Okay. And he was doing a event at Conservative Conference. This would have been like 2015. So after the Tories had won the general election, but we hadn't had the EU referendum yet. And everybody was putting their stall out for why they were going to argue for Leave or Remain. And this chap was a Leaver, and he said, oh, well, it'll be great because I've got a guy in my constituency. He's an immigrant from Pakistan, and he can't get his family to come over. And what's going to be great is if we leave the EU, we can have a much more liberal immigration policy, and we can allow this guy to bring his family over. And I remember the crowd of sort of Tory activists looking absolutely horrified at this idea. This sort of like, no, this isn't what we want. I think the other debate that we had around Brexit and borders was a lot of people. One argument I really remember was, well, we could have something like the US-Canadian border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And as soon as any Brexiteer said that, what I immediately knew is they don't know anything about the US-Canada border. They have never been there ever in their lives. They think in their imaginations it's a bit like the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland anyway, but probably with a few more, check stops. A border, but a light touch border, which the US-Canadian border is not. It's a very, 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 very hardcore border. And particularly given it's really, really hardcore in both directions. So, I mean, US-Mexico is pretty hardcore in places, but really it's only really hardcore going one way. And that's Mexico into the US. Getting into Mexico from the US is a piece of piss. Whereas US-Canada is really harsh both sides. Both sides really, really guard that border. The Canadians mostly because they're worried about drugs and guns. And the US because they're just paranoid, generally, about foreigners coming in. So, yeah, that explains that, really. And yeah, it's a really hardcore border. And I thought that was just such an interesting idea that we were having this argument, this discussion about borders and what we wanted borders to look like post-Brexit. And there was this idea of what to do about the Irish border, and people were like projecting onto it. They were like talking about border situations that don't actually exist in reality. But to come along to the question posed by the title, is the Irish border the future? And what I mean by that is, are we going to have looser borders? And that seems like really odd as a question. As soon as I say it, that almost seems esoteric, because you can throw that back in my face going, Nick, every country in the West is going more to the right. The Overton window on immigration is just constantly getting more and more conservative. There seems to be more and more of a push for borders. But here's what I think. I think we're probably going to have a lot more right-wing governments throughout continental Europe. But they'll be faced with a choice, which is, okay, do we want to end freedom of movement, or do we want to push for the European Union to end freedom of movement? Because, by the way, reality check, none of these countries are leaving the EU. I know this is a fantasy of UK Brexiteers. They're not going to, because, I mean, for a start, I saw what happened to Britain, and they don't want to repeat that. So that was an example of what not to do. And second of all, yeah, they want to be in the single market, and they don't want to be outside of it, and they see what a nightmare it is being on the outside of the single market. So what they could do, though, is try and push the EU collectively. I mean, if you had like Meloni in Italy, you had Le Pen in France, let's say, maybe you had a few more right-wing governments, you had a more right-wing government in Germany even, let's say, uh, would they pressure the EU to, well, would they, so here's the question, would they focus on trying to end, not end freedom of movement necessarily, but end Schengen, end the sort of borderless idea within between European states? And so would you start to see, border checks between France and Spain and France and Germany again, etc., etc., which would be politically difficult, I think. I think even for countries which would have people essentially voting for right-wing parties or even far-right parties because they want to control immigration, suddenly you've got the borders back between European countries, and I think that will be difficult. Or do they push the EU to be, for the external borders, to be much harsher, to be much stronger, to be much more, like you sort of have a US, Canada / North and South Korea demilitarized zone. You have something really, really strict between basically the periphery of the EU becomes way stronger, which I think is probably where we're going to go. But then that brings us back to the Irish border problem, because basically Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland share a border between a EU state and a non-EU state, and it's fudged because of the Windsor Agreement and the situation that Northern Ireland ended up in, and sort of being in the UK and the EU. It's all very complicated at the same time. But if you're not going to police that border, you're going to end up with something much harsher between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, I think. And I think that's probably where that's what's going to end up happening. I think the idea that you can travel to Liverpool, from Liverpool to Belfast on a ferry and not have to show your passport, that will go. I think that will disappear. And the border between Northern Ireland and Britain will become really strong. And that's what I think. So I think actually, I experienced something that will someday, not that long from now, essentially be a relic of the past, which is traveling between Great Britain and Northern Ireland without having to show your passport, and back again, by the way, without having to show your passport, with 3 kids as well. Like it wasn't just that I didn't have to show my passport, or my wife didn't have to show her passport. I had 3 kids and I didn't have to show their passports. So it's pretty loose at the moment. And I don't think that survives that long. I think where we're going to go is the EU is going to have much stronger external borders. That's what I think. Because I just think trying to undo Schengen and trying to, for the countries themselves to have harsher borders between each other will just be too politically difficult and too logistically difficult as well. So I think stronger EU borders is what's coming, and the way that will affect the island of Ireland is very interesting, particularly if we're getting to a point where reunification or unification of Ireland, reunification, I shouldn't have said that, sorry, you can strike that from the record, unification of Ireland will be much more on the cards, and that's one of the things that could tip it over the edge, where it just becomes like, well, Northern Ireland is not really part of the UK anymore. There's gonna have to be a thing whereby the EU just demand a much stronger border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And as we've seen throughout the entire Brexit process, they will get what they want. That's the thing about Brexit. Every single step of the way, the EU has pretty much got exactly what it wanted, and Britain has not got anything it wanted. Britain wanted a very, it didn't want to have a customs border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. That happened. It didn't want to have to leave the single market entirely. It did. It wanted all of its fishing back. It didn't get that. It didn't want to have to pay the EU, sort of an amount for debts owed for leaving, etc. The EU in the end, the UK agreed to do that. So the EU will win this one, won't they? Of course they will. And what that means, I don't know. But anyway, thank you for listening. As ever, I enjoy my new audience. Keep it up. I like the all the comments. I mean, not all the comments, as you, well, if you're watching YouTube, you'd know what that means. Yeah, but actually, the comments have mostly been nice, have mostly been lovely, and actually really well, really thoughtful, and I think well informed most of the time. I am getting some of the why don't you piss off you foreigner type of thing, but I'm completely used to that, and that rolls off my back very very easily. Being called a foreigner by Irish people just doesn't affect me at all because I don't make any pretense to being Irish. I've never lived in Ireland. I wasn't born in Ireland. My parents aren't Irish. You know, my I'm sure you go back enough in time, and pretty much all of my ancestors are Irish, but I don't live in the past, and I don't think what happened in the 1840s is particularly relevant to my life, at least enough for me to claim an entire identity that I don't really have, or I don't really feel in my soul. I mean, I love Ireland. I think it's great, but someone called me a foreigner. I don't really mind. Someone from Northern Ireland called me that, which I thought was funny because I am in fact a British citizen, and actually it is the only citizenship of which I am absolutely 100% sure I actually have. I'm pretty sure I must be a Canadian citizen, but I've never had a passport. I don't have a way of proving it. I don't even like I could me getting a Canadian passport. I don't even know how I would do it. Like for a start, I'd have to get a birth certificate from Ontario, which is I've tried it and it's exceedingly hard and I've never succeeded. Mostly because I don't know anyone in Ontario. That's the thing. Like I don't know anyone in Canada. I haven't even been to Canada in almost 15 years. Um, so yeah. So just the guy from Northern Ireland, and I was sort of like, is he calling me a foreigner because he thinks I'm not a British citizen, so he's not considering me British? Is he calling me a foreigner because he, even despite being in Northern Ireland, considers himself Irish and therefore I don't know. Again, like the border and like the Windsor Agreement and like everything that happened to Ireland with Brexit, it's all very complicated. Anyway, I'll end it there. I'm Nick Tyrone, neoliberal centrist dad. If you've got this far into the video, I presume you've got something out of it. And if you could like the video, if you could subscribe to the channel, all that stuff's just really helpful in terms of, building the audience, trying to build what I'm doing. So that'd be great. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next time.